This is Barry Glassman, Harford County Executive, and you're listening to the 200th episode of the Maryland Association of Counties podcast. Happy 200th, Conduit Street.
And welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, it's Wednesday, May 11th, and today is a huge milestone for the Conduit Street Podcast. Number 200, our 200th episode. Hard to believe it, but a little reflection on how we got here from you, I think, is in order.
Well, thanks for the setup. And I mean, we know people love the round numbers, right? So it's pretty cool. I would say, aside from the round number, what I'm awfully happy and proud about with this little thing we started a few years ago was, we had this idea. We were doing a conference call for county officials to dial in on Fridays during session to hear what's been going on in Annapolis. And the whole idea was, let's try and reach a level deeper than the people who are able to travel to Annapolis for a meeting and talk about specific bills and join on the legislative committee and that kind of thing. And we were happy to get 15, 20, 25 people to dial in. There would always be some people who would call and say, did you record the call? I'd like to hear what happened. I just wasn't available at that time. And anyway, it evolved into this podcast. And the idea of wrapping up policy and politics around Maryland, sometimes with a county focus and sometimes not, just seems to have scratched an itch that was out there. So what we thought might be 50 people has now turned into thousands of subscribers, listeners, and downloads for every episode. I will say, I don't think this happens in anything like that fashion without your time and stewardship, Kevin. You've been on every single episode. You do the work behind the scenes, and you're the one who makes this come together. So hats off to you. This is a big success for our association and for our members and listeners.
Very happy about the podcast and its growth. And of course, it doesn't all come together without the Mako shop. I think we have some people in our office more excited than maybe you and I are. And you'll see some stuff on the social media channels and whatnot. But hats off to you as well. It's a big accomplishment. And part of the success and the growth allows us to get awesome guests on the podcast. And we have one today, Nicholas Redding, the president and CEO of Preservation Maryland. I'm really excited about this one. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here. It's it's perfect for a preservation group to be here on a historic day for the 200th episode of Conduit Street.
I like that.
This one might go in the time capsule.
Yeah, we'll say that we set that up just in time. But Nicholas, you're the president and CEO of our state's oldest, largest, and most effective preservation organization. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Preservation Maryland. So tell us a little bit about Preservation Maryland, what your goals are, and what you do day to day.
Yeah, sure. So, well, it's great to be here, and I'm a fellow podcaster, so I'm impressed by the effort that you guys put into this, and I'm a listener of Conduit Street, and really enjoy being here with you guys. So, so Preservation Maryland's a pretty interesting organization. We've been around 91 years. So we were founded back in 1931, and we joke that we were the original Washington Slept Here organization. We actually were founded to mark sites associated with George Washington in Maryland, because Washington, depending on which calendar you look at, was born in 1732. And so the 200th anniversary of Washington's birth fell in 1932, and the whole idea was that we were going to mark all these sites. We did one small project in 1932, and then the Depression really picked up, and we didn't really end up becoming much of an organization until after World War II. And we've like anything that would be 90 years old, we've changed focus over the years and done different things. We started as an organization that owned historic properties, some of which you're probably familiar with. Old Y Mill, everybody sees that sign when you go over the Bay Bridge. Yeah. We used to own that. We used to own and operate Hampton Mansion, which became a National Park Service site there in Baltimore County, and a variety of other places. But over the years, that transition to becoming a much stronger advocacy organization as sort of the preservation community shifted. And then what's old is new again, or the past is prologue, whichever way you look at it. And we have kind of dove back in to bricks and mortar and actually getting our hands dirty, rehabilitating structures. We have a pretty dynamic historic trades training program where we're putting people in the field and training them in partnership with the National Park Service, and doing historic trades training. And some of that involved advocacy this year in the General Assembly. So we like to think that our goal is not just to save one building, but how can we use advocacy and sort of a broader vision of impact to save thousands of buildings and impact communities all across the state. So we can talk about all those different programs, but we're a diverse and dynamic and growing organization. I've been here coming up on 8 years, and we started with, I think we had 5 employees when I got there, and we just hired 2 more, so we'll be up to close to 18 employees by the end of the month.
Well, Nick, that setup is helpful for, I think that helps lay out why we were excited to bring you on and talk about the work of the organization and sort of the preservation effort generally in the state. I'm really interested, though, as sort of a sidelight, that we have a similar past. Our association was formed decades ago, largely as an internal service organization, so that the county commissioners and elected officials could sort of share best practices with one another and do member education and things along those lines. And MACO as an organization becoming engaged in policy and advocacy came later as a realization that we were stakeholders in policy decisions before the state legislature, in the budget, by state agencies and so forth. That sort of naturally evolved from our members. And it sounds like that was part of Preservation Maryland's evolution too. So it probably puts us in a similar spot. Can you talk a little bit about being a policy advocate in a weird way? I mean, we think of, moneyed special interests who have political action committees and have influence over policy, but the kind of work that Preservation Maryland does is pretty different from that. But you all see it as part of your mission to engage with policy leaders and with agencies and so forth. Can you lay that out a little bit more for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of people think lobbying and they think, like you said, moneyed interests and things like that. And there's different versions of that. I think it all comes back to this sort of conversation that was had probably 20, 30 years ago where, I think a lot of people think of preservation groups as sort of like coming in at the last moment and trying to tie themselves to a building and stop a bulldozer and things like that. And we do so very little of that. I haven't tied myself to a building in years now. So I've actually never done it. But the idea basically is that, if we put policy in place that makes preservation more financially feasible and of benefit to communities, then more people will take advantage of it. It's far easier to get people to do things when policy makes it possible than it is to kind of like badger them into doing things. And so we're very mindful of that and mindful of the idea that, if we put all our eggs in one basket, we can save one building or, we could stop one thing from being demolished. But if we create a really robust historic tax credit program, like we've championed for years now, we can, literally impact thousands of buildings across the state and change the landscape of community redevelopment and revitalization and infill development by doing that. I think one of the interesting things about being a sort of a nonprofit policy and advocacy shop is that a lot of what we advocate for, or I would say most of what we advocate for, doesn't really directly benefit us. It benefits the community of which we serve. And we sort of see ourselves as an organization focused on service to others and service to community. And that's sort of the goal of the vast majority of our policy work is putting the funding and the tools in place that makes preservation not only possible, but makes preservation something that communities want to use instead of something that they feel like they have to do.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it and a great analogy. I think MACO and Preservation Maryland are aligned in that regard. We're not the biggest shops, but we rely on our expertise, and we may not have the packs, but we do have our word, and people respect, I think, both organizations and understand that when we're at the table, you can take it to the bank, right? And the important work that we're doing, I think, the stuff that you're talking about, getting the right tools in the toolbox to make sure that not only are you going to save a building, 2 buildings, you're going to create programs that are long lasting and that actually incentivize people to want to engage and understand the importance of preservation. And I also think it's great timing to have you on here as we sit in May, because May is National Preservation Month. And you've talked about George Washington and how preservation in Maryland got its start. And National Preservation Month is all about celebrating the nation's diverse and unique heritage. And of course, Maryland is certainly a big part of that. So I'm sure that you all are excited about National Preservation Month, and you are pushing out great content to remind people about the importance of preservation. And from where we sit, the especially importance of preservation in Maryland.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the it's interesting you bring that up, this idea of diversity and where we came from, our roots, and where we are today. So, I obviously we're this organization that has this Washingtonian beginning, but today, we're an organization that really is looking at how do we tell stories that speak to all aspects of Maryland's life and the people who make up Maryland. And so we're keenly aware of and really focused on trying to bring forward those stories and provide resources to preserve sort of underrepresented history. We did one of the first statewide context studies, which basically is a way of looking at the context of history and sites and physical places that represent that. And we did a study that looked at LGBTQ history and sites associated with it all across the state. It was the second statewide study like that in the nation. We're doing currently something that I'm sure Mako will be interested in the results of, a study on a context study on the history of school construction and development across the state, and the different types of historic school construction, and how that tells a story not only of how the state invested in education, but how it didn't invest, and separate but unequal policies, and how that's rooted in the landscape. So we're really interested in sort of bringing forward those stories, and see this as a month to kind of celebrate and contemplate and confront different aspects of history, because not all of our history is history that's to be celebrated, but it's all history that needs to be recognized and understood and appreciated in one way or the other. That's our job, and the job of preservation is wide ranging these days. It touches on things that are both physical and intangible.
I think that's well put, and you are probably very right that the findings of that delving into the history of school construction, I think, would be a very popular item at a future Mako conference or event. I think there'd be a lot of county officials who'd be really interested in that, both just knowing about the history and background of those issues, but also whatever shadow that casts on the way we think about school buildings as part of community definition today, I'm sure has roots that go back in history. So we'll put a pin in that, because that sounds like it's worth following up on to me.
For sure. And I think, talking about school buildings, and we've talked about saving a building or two versus, really getting the community to invest in preservation and understand the importance of it. But I think, Nick, when most people think about preservation, they think about those tangible things, right? Like an historic building or a space. But we don't often think about the parts of history that we can't touch. We're talking about historical knowledge, personal experiences, but those intangible things are a big part of what you do, right? It's not just the buildings. It is also the personal stories and the history that is such a big part of preservation generally.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of people, and you guys are, and I say this in the kindest of ways, policy wonks. And so you understand how policy shapes the way in which we see the world and the way in which we, engage in different types of projects and things like that. Preservation, has a long legacy and a long shadow of policy going back to the 60s. And, the National Register of Historic Places is very focused on place. So I think a lot of people sort of connect preservation specifically with place. But with certain communities, African American communities that have lost those places, perhaps the only thing that connects them to those stories is sort of the intangible culture. And so it's something that we've really begun to embrace as a component of preservation, because not every physical place that tells a story is left. And not every aspect of Maryland history is rooted in place, but there's certainly important components of history that go beyond just the physical structures. So, whether that be food, whether that be music, whether that be, the celebrations, the stories, the storytelling, all of that is kind of combined and is an important component. It's actually why, it's interesting hearing about why you guys launched your podcast. And one of the reasons we launched ours is that we wanted to be able to kind of do in-depth stories that talk to people about those things that kind of go beyond physical place and how story and intangible culture connects with place. So it's part of the reason we've done that. And it's definitely a component and a growing component of our work. Because, in sort of a silly way, nostalgia is a powerful drug, and people love connecting with story and place. And story is what adds value and what makes people not only fall in love, but also are willing to preserve and engage in preservation. It's the stories. It's not just the buildings themselves. So storytelling and that intangible culture is a critical component of what we do. And I would imagine in the same way with Mako, right? Getting policy across isn't just because it's good policy, but there's story behind it about why it matters.
Yeah, and I'm sure you can relate. I mean, if you're sitting at the testimony table and you're just, going through here's number A, here's column B, here's what these numbers mean. That's all boring, and everybody can understand that and read a fiscal note. But when you can get somebody up there to actually explain the impact that something has on a community, that hits home with legislators and everyone, really. And if they can make that connection, if you can make a personal connection with someone through a personal story or through this impacted me in X way, and here's why that's different from what you see in a fiscal note, I think that is a huge selling point. And it's a big part of what both of our organizations do, trying to tell the story, make sure people understand that we're talking about real world stuff here that affects real world people across the state. I think that's well put, and it makes a lot of sense. And I think there are endless examples of your advocacy in action. I mean, from partnering with the Baltimore Museum of Industry to save a 100-foot tall World War II era crane in the city, to preserving Harriet Tubman's legacy on the Eastern Shore. A lot of what you do is right out there in the open for everyone to see, and you can see those results. And I also am interested in your 6 to Fix program. That seems to be a lot of what you do and a part of your big success as well.
Yeah, that was a program we launched several years ago, because when I got here, we were doing an endangered list, and a lot of preservation groups do that. And I used to joke that it was sort of just this sad list that we published every year of things that were really sad. And then we didn't really do anything about them. And so we transitioned into a program called 6 to Fix, where we would identify 6 projects on a yearly basis and engage and do work on them. And that has even sort of transitioned through the pandemic into really hands-on property redevelopment projects, where we've actually then taken direct action and are working with municipalities and private property owners and others to rehabilitate structures. And so it takes a wide variety of paths. Obviously advocacy is always a component of it. You need either policy or funding to make these things possible. So, our partners at the Baltimore Museum of Industry did an amazing project in rehabilitating their World War II era crane with great support from the team in District 46. From a project like that to working in partnership with sites along the Harriet Tubman Byway. We worked with a group at Malone's Church out in Dorchester County to try and gave them strategic planning support to kind of think through how they wanted to evolve that site and what they wanted to do with it. So some of it is very, find the money. Some of it is help them build a vision. And then, through the pandemic, we've launched this property redevelopment program where we've actually, in some cases, acquired threatened structures, rehabilitated them, and then sold them for owner-occupied affordable housing. We did a project like that in Hagerstown. And now we have a big project not far from Conduit Street. If you poke your head out, you might even be able to see it. We're going to be working in partnership with the city of Annapolis to stabilize and elevate the Burtis House, which is the last remaining waterman's cottage down on the end of City Dock. And that is going to be elevated almost 8.5, 9 feet in the air. Eventually, the rest of City Dock will meet it. And that is a project to save that building and then hopefully create some type of visitor contact station, perhaps even for the National Park Service right there at the edge of City Dock. So we have a variety of different ways of engaging and managing those projects and actually showing the power of preservation in a very physical way. And those are just a handful of the ones that we're working with right now.
Well, I like the mentality of the 6 to fix approach. Like even in your description, you talked about turning it from sort of a negative to a positive and with an optimistic spin. These are the things we want to target for the good. And to some degree, like outreach on having a list of target projects like that. I mean, this goes back to, I mean, forgive me, it's maybe a torture analogy, but this is sort of like the FBI's Most Wanted, right? You put pictures up at the post office to tell people, you know, we're doing work to keep you safe, and here are some of the people we're after. This person robbed a bank, and this person did these violent deeds, and so forth. And this is who we're trying to track down as we're going to get these bad guys. It's kind of the same mentality. We've got projects that are really worthy, and you should care about them too. And here's what we want to accomplish on our to-do list. I think that way of messaging your next steps is a good way to get broader buy-in for the kinds of things that, I mean, honestly, when I read that list, I'm going to get motivated behind them too. And I'm sure that's exactly the intent. So I kind of like that philosophy at the very least.
Yeah, it's really tangible. I mean, and particularly as we've even transitioned into doing these hands-on projects and managing them and raising the money and then partnering, whether we buy them directly or we partner with an organization or a municipality or we're working with Howard County on one. I think it's very easy for people to kind of see exactly where we're trying to head rather than just kind of having a list of whether it be priorities or things that are going wrong, but it's like, here's specific things that we can do together to fix that. And so we try and be very impact driven. And it's the same thing in our historic trades program. So we launched in partnership with the National Park Service. One of Maryland's best kept secrets is that the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Training Center is based in Frederick, Maryland. And nearly 100 master craftspeople based out of that shop. And we are their charitable partner and are working not only to recruit trainees for that program, but also now we're working in partnership with them to establish registered apprenticeships for historic trades training. And so it's a very specific and hands-on and direct way of trying to change the nature of trades in the country, and particularly historic trades. And we're just fortunate to have this national unit right in our backyard and a great partnership with them. But it's another example of where we can specifically show how we're kind of doing our work. And I think that that's really important in nonprofit work, particularly in advocacy. And that's the cool balance of us, is that we have the advocacy that supports the direct and hands-on piece, which allows us to kind of show the power of advocacy in a very physical way.
Right. Well, on issues of advocacy, I think the sort of Venn diagram for Preservation Maryland and the Maryland Association of Counties has a pretty substantial overlap. There are some things that local governments are really invested in, similar to your members and stakeholders. I'm thinking of things like program open space, which, to abbreviate a big and complicated program, is basically a way that Maryland takes some tax revenue that arises from real estate development and says, let's take some of that money that shows up, especially in a hot real estate market, and use it to target sensitive areas and do some preservation work. There's a number of things affiliated with Program Open Space that also come out of the state transfer tax under the same philosophy, including some historic preservation funding. All of that stuff is, I think, a really interesting and novel focus for Maryland public policy, and we do, generally speaking, a good idea, a good deal of that. There's a lot of smart growth related policies that to some degree it's about generic sprawl and focused development where the infrastructure exists and where there's capacity, but it's also recognizing important and sensitive and historic locations as part of your land use plan. And I think we've got some common interest there. I think all those things are interesting policy areas for folks like us to engage as advocates. Historic property redevelopment feels like it might be sort of a next frontier on that front. And that's one of the areas that Preservation Maryland is focused on as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right on all of that. I mean, we've been champions of program open space for years. I actually, for 2 or 3 years, chaired the Partners for Open Space, which was an interesting kind of overlap between us and the more traditional environmental world. I think it was a great kind of connection between the two, because we sort of see it as the offensive game for preservation, right? If you don't sprawl out, then the focus is on revitalizing what you already have, and that disproportionately is historic structures. So it's sort of a long game for preservation, but we see sort of the value between the two. And also, you can't disconnect Maryland's landscape from our history, right? Like, the history of agriculture and the landscapes of Maryland are so evocative, and they are a part of our historic landscape. So history is rooted in the landscape, whether there's a building there or not. So it's important for us. And I think you're exactly right in terms of like big picture, how Maryland grows. I like to think that property redevelopment, take preservation out of it. Let's say you're not super focused on the historic side, but just reusing what we already have and reinvesting in existing communities is critically important, because we can't grow our way out of every problem. And the state only has so much land, and it doesn't really make sense to keep sprawling out when we have underutilized, large strip malls and things like that could be rezoned and made more effective. So I think that there's an interesting balance and an opportunity for advocates who just care about community development to take a look at the tools and policies that we've created on the redevelopment side and the preservation side as a tool for community infill and redevelopment. I think it's, in 2 or 3 years ago, when 1,000 Friends was absorbed into the operations of Preservation Maryland, we relaunched it as a program called Smart Growth Maryland. And so we lead advocacy coalitions in some of the fastest growing counties around the state to try and incentivize, smarter growth policies and reinvestment in historic communities. And I think if you look at, we obviously Maryland has been a leader in smart growth, and we've done a really good job on land preservation. I don't think we've always done as good a job on the other side of that coin, which is how do we make it easier for communities to redevelop what they already have. And I think moving forward that needs to be a priority. And I think a lot of counties would clamor for that kind of support and ability. So it's definitely an area of overlap and interest between MACO and Preservation Maryland.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you piqued my interest when you talk about sort of the redeveloping what you already have. And we try to be glass half full. And when you talk about the pandemic, we know how awful it's been and all of the bad things that have come from it. But we also see some opportunities moving forward. And when you talk about, the evolution of, the mall, right? And we know that's sort of out the window with how people and consumers want to shop. And so rethinking sort of these giant spaces where we have these dilapidated buildings that were formerly malls or whatnot, and trying to instead come up with ways to redevelop that land and make it, benefit for the community. That has to be something that you're thinking about too, as we hopefully come out of this pandemic. The opportunities that we've seen and things that we've learned, I think that's going to play a big role in your advocacy moving forward. I'd imagine so, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think, you hit the nail on the head where it's even if you take preservation and, just having a conversation about policy around revitalization of underutilized spaces and, things that aren't paying their fair share under the tax roll. I mean, that's where counties really should care the most, right? Like, obviously they want good communities and all that kind of thing, but they also need to be able to pay the bills. And so underutilized spaces, should be of interest. It benefits preservation, so obviously we're interested in it. But you're right. I mean, not every mall is historic, but certainly those spaces need to be reutilized. And there's interesting sort of policy examples from across the country that Maryland could take a look at sort of in the years ahead. There's these abandoned mill tax credits in North Carolina, abandoned property or vacant property tax credits in South Carolina, where the idea is to try and to sort of get sort of projects moving in these spaces. And so I think that there's more that we can do collectively on sort of the infill and redevelopment of existing space, and even incentivizing counties to, kind of think about how, using sort of the carrot policy of, how do you take, I'm thinking, I live in Frederick, and, we have vast stretches of sort of underutilized, strip mall space. And, the way people are shopping now, and so much of that moving online, what happens to these big box stores that really don't have any value anymore? Is there a way to incentivize the rezoning of places like that to benefit affordable housing and kind of let the market do it? Because if it's rezoned in such a way that it makes more sense to reuse that space for affordable housing or workforce housing or whatever it might be that benefits that community, that reuses existing space instead of having to kind of sprawl out. So I think that there's a lot of interesting overlap and a lot of work to be done in the years ahead, particularly as we see how the pandemic shakes out and how it reshapes the nature of real estate. The other piece, you've mentioned malls, but there's a lot of office space that people just aren't going to go back to. So what do we do with that? And how do we reuse that and revitalize that? And I think the preservation community has some tools up its sleeve and some experience in that can be of value to just the broader community redevelopment community.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about affordable housing forever. I think we should have you back on just to talk about affordable housing and how the pandemic is sort of reshaping the way we think about opportunities out there and reducing that sprawl and using what we have. But I also think that brings into mind the equity component of all of this, right? And preservation is certainly a tool for a more equitable future. That has to be something that you and your team think about a lot. It introduces a set of questions into the decision-making process that focuses on equity, both in the process and the outcome. So talk a little bit more about how preservation can be used as a tool to promote equity for everyone moving forward.
Yeah, well, that's a big question. And just as an aside, when you talk about affordable housing, we did a whole white paper on affordable housing and historic preservation, which is a kind of a component of this broader question around equity. Historic communities actually, we got a lot of knocks against historic communities that they're tools for gentrification, that they stymie growth, that it prevents the natural progression of a community. And we have a lot of good data that refutes most of that. Historic communities tend to be some of the most diverse in terms of building stock. So you have a wide variety of different types of structures. And we hear a lot about this, and you maybe have touched on this before, where sort of this idea of the missing middle when it comes to housing. And it always makes me laugh because I'm like, oh, they're describing historic neighborhoods, right? Because that's what we have. It naturally occurs. I live in a little community here in Frederick County, in Walkersville, Maryland. And, the neighborhood that I live in, there are duplexes, there are single family homes, there are row homes. There's just this wide variety of different things on this street. In most zoning across, not to knock the counties, but most zoning across Maryland would never permit where I live to be built. And so in terms of equity, preservation has a lot to offer. I could really kind of wonk out on all the different stats and figures and stuff like that. But one of the things that you see that's interesting that provides a lot of opportunities to kind of create more equitable development patterns is that historic communities have one of the widest swings in value of structures within one given area. So if you have like a new subdivision development, you might have a difference of maybe 5% between the most expensive house and the cheapest house. And it probably has to do with whether or not it has a finished basement or something. But in a historic community, you can have a swing of like 60 to 70% between the cheapest and the most expensive. And so what that means is you can have a wide variety of incomes living all within one area and have that mixed income approach that we try and kind of artificially create now, and it just sort of naturally occurs in historic communities. And we talk about sort of naturally occurring affordable housing in historic communities. So that's all to say that we think that there's tremendous value. But in order to make that possible, again, coming back to policy, we have to have policies in place that make it easier to rehab structures, for people to invest in historic places, and be able to have the tools in place to do some of that work. And so, the equity of this and providing, resources for every Marylander, no matter their income or where they come from, is of great importance to us. And it's why we've tried to sort of democratize the residential tax credit. We have a tax credit for historic residential property owners, and we have a great one in Maryland because it's refundable. So unlike a lot of states, where the tax credit's only equal to your taxable income, here in Maryland, you get a check back, which makes it a lot more usable for various income levels. So yeah, equity is a huge component of our work. We've just established our first DEIJ policy as an organization and sort of charting how we want to do this work. But it is central to everything we think about in terms of how we equitably invest in communities and the redevelopment and preservation of historic resources.
Yeah, and of course, zoning is a monster in itself. But one of the things I like about what you all do is that you do reach out to county governments, to municipalities, to the actual communities themselves, because I think you can understand and that one size fits all does not work very well. And so being on the ground, talking with community members, talking with local governments and understanding, what the needs are, what the opportunities are, and looking at it through that lens makes a lot more sense than trying to just create some blanket policy that, can't be implemented in many places across the state. So I really think that that's the correct approach. That's one that we prefer as well. And it seems like you all do a good job of that, being boots on the ground in communities, seeing what's going on and understanding what the opportunities and challenges are, instead of just, going to the General Assembly and saying, hey, we want to just do this thing across the state. It's going to be great. And then it sort of falls apart. And that doesn't benefit anyone, right? So it's really important to get that local buy-in and for people to be able to understand and see what the benefits are going to be with some of the stuff that you guys do locally.
Yeah, I think, interestingly, blanket policies just don't work in Maryland. It's funny, we're such a small state, but still there's nuances in the way that communities have developed and what they need. And so the only type of blanket things we ever try and create are policies that create incentives so that communities can take advantage of things, because that pretty much across the board, everybody needs money. So it never hurts to have a tax credit that benefits everyone. But yeah, I don't think sort of blanket zoning, or forcing things across the board really ever works. And I'm so terrified of Mako, I would never go that route anyway. So.
I think, joking aside, it is a reasonable, read of the room that we've got circumstances in, Mountain Maryland and the lower Eastern Shore and the built up suburban part of the state that just are fundamentally different. And so, having different game plans for different areas makes sense. And sometimes a flexible tool is the right way to do it. And sometimes it'll take a partnership in each of those areas to come up with something that's tailored well. But so one thing you teed off with early was that your shop is also in the podcasting business. So we've got followers here on Conduit Street. And for those who have made it through this conversation, some of them are county type people, but a lot are just interested in public policy and in the kind of stuff that we've been talking about. So you've got some potential listeners here among our followers. Pitch to the Conduit Street listener what they ought to be listening to in their podcast feed if they like what they heard today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you can't get enough of me, there's over 230 episodes of me talking about preservation and history. And it's called PreserveCast, and you can pick it up anywhere you want. You can go to preservecast.org and take a look at all of our back episodes and everything there, or you can get it on iTunes and Stitcher and Amazon and wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, it's all there. But what we cover, interestingly, even though we're based in Maryland, the whole idea was preservation didn't really have sort of a podcast voice. And so 3-4 years ago, we launched this thing. I was crazy enough to think we would try and do it weekly, and we've pretty much kept that. We took a short sort of hiatus where we went monthly, and we lost a bunch of listeners, and we said, all right, we're going back and we're doing it weekly. And so because we pump out so much content, it's not just Maryland. So if you're interested in just preservation and history writ large, we talk to people from really all across the world. We have a great connection with some friends in England. And so we talk to people overseas quite a bit. We talk to, we joke on the podcast, it's everything from drones to mudlarking. And if you want to know what mudlarking is, then you can download the mudlarking episode and learn about how people try and spot pottery and coins on the foreshore of the River Thames. So we cover a lot of ground. We try and make it sort of topical. So we have a great one coming up on Juneteenth and the celebration of Juneteenth in Maryland. Talking with folks from MNC PPC down in Prince George's County and the work that they're doing there to celebrate the new federal holiday. We cover, we talk to a lot of different authors about history books and new topics in the field. So if you're interested in preservation history and sort of the movers and shakers and the people who are making it possible out there, that's what we cover. And it's weekly, and we have a lot of fun doing it, and have, just like, you kind of talked about the value early on, being this is your 200th episode. We've seen tremendous value from it. It's created a lot of great networking and opportunities for us to kind of talk to different people in interesting topics and allow us to cover a lot of ground. So that's where you can find it, at preservecast.org. And we would love to have more listeners join us there.
Well, I like the tease. So definitely, I've been scribbling notes to myself on episodes that I'm going to have to dig back into and go listen to. But don't give us the whole payoff, because I want to go listen to this stuff myself. I'm in now.
Yeah, we've got some interesting stuff. I'll give you one more tease, which is we interviewed the historian of Rankin Bass Productions. This was around Christmas time. So for those of you who are fans of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, we talked about preserving the actual puppets from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. So we go everything from mudlarking to drones to buildings to Rudolph puppets.
Yeah, and like the Heat Miser and Yukon Cornelius.
Oh,
I would be down for that. So all right, I'm in. I'm all in for that.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to the right audience here. These are our people, right? Your drones and preserving Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer puppets. I mean, that's pretty interesting. I don't think you can do a better tease there. So we'll make sure that we include all these links on the show notes, and then also links to your social media and things like that, so people that can connect with you. One thing I think I'd be remiss if we didn't cover quickly, you had a big win in the 2022 session when it comes to the Historic Revitalization Tax Credit Program. You talked a little bit about that, but that is absolutely vital to preserving our rich history. Talk about what happened in the 2022 session and why that program is going to be much better moving forward.
Yeah, our lobbying team and in-house, Ellie Cowan, our Director of Government Relations, worked really hard. She's our registered lobbyist there in Annapolis and spends most of session there in Annapolis doing all that work, and worked really hard and had a lot of support from the General Assembly, Corey McRae and Stephanie Smith and Eric Lutke, Katie Fry-Hester, to name just a few, really worked hard. And as well as I have to give a great plug to the administration, who got us into one of the supplementals and took the historic tax credit program. So the large commercial is the one that kind of incentivizes these big projects that you're familiar with, Tide Point and these larger scale projects. The ones down in Fells and the mills of the Jones Falls Valley, places like that, these catalytic projects. And for so long, the program had languished after the financial crisis back in 2008 and had been cut. And eventually it was just $9 million a year. So to give you some context, Virginia does, we always throw this out there, Virginia does $100 million a year of these credits. We are doing 9. West Virginia is doing 30 million a year of them. And if you look at a state that's even closer in budget and size, so Massachusetts, which is oftentimes what we compare ourselves to, they're doing 50 million a year of them. So we're like not even in the same sort of orbit of our peers. And so we had been sort of banging the drum for years to try and fix this, and this was the year to get it done. And so we've increased it to 22 million, and then by mid-decade it'll get up into the 30 millions, which is, and we've also been able to increase the per project cap, which with inflation is really important. So instead of it being a $3 million per project cap, it goes up to 5 million potential credits. So it's the number one tool we have for community redevelopment and investment in historic structures. And it has transformed communities all across the state. Over in East Baltimore, the Hohen Lithograph Company, which is now an ABC training center and component of the whole campus over there, to, Western Maryland, out in Cumberland, we've seen mega projects happen, and then of course over on the shore, in Cambridge, with the Phillips Packing Company project, which is another amazing rehab. So it impacts disparate and diverse communities all across the state. And after years of howling in the wilderness, we seem to have struck on something and got a lot of great support for it. And that's a big win. Not for us, again, back to that whole thing of service. We won't see any of that 22 million, but the communities that we support and that we care so much about will, and that's an exciting win for us. And kind of underscores the long-term value of relationship building and advocacy. It doesn't always happen overnight, as you guys probably know very well.
No doubt about it. A huge win there for not only Preservation Maryland, but for the state. And Nick, we've covered a lot of ground here today. I want to let you close with anything that we may have missed, but I do have one question for you. I'll put you on the spot a little bit. I know you previously served as a park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park and Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park. Give us one of your best experiences doing that. I'm jealous that you were able to do that, especially up in Gettysburg, history nerd. That had to be a really amazing experience. Do you have any takeaways quickly that you can share with our listeners, and maybe another way to get some of these folks to listen to your podcast, which 230 episodes strong? Congratulations on that. I know it's a lot of work.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of stories about Gettysburg. And there's some great Gettysburg episodes of PreserveCast where we've talked to some folks up at Gettysburg about different things that are happening up there. So if you want to dive into that, we have some great Civil War history episodes of PreserveCast. You know what I would say so two things about Gettysburg two of many, maybe three. All right, I'll leave you with three. One is a pandemic Gettysburg story, so it doesn't go back to being a park ranger, but during the pandemic, it was like, what the heck are we going to do? Got a young 5-year-old. I guess she was 3 when it started. She's 5 now. And we had to get out of mom's hair. And so we decided that we would go on Civil War adventures, and being able to share a historic place with your child and kind of use it as a stress relief valve was incredible. And so we went on, I think we counted them. We went like 60 times to Gettysburg. It's only about 25 minutes from my house. And sort of fell back in love with it. Never really fell out of love with it, but it took on a new value and a new meaning to kind of see it through your child's eyes. So that was one thing that the pandemic brought that was a silver lining and sort of a way for me to re-engage with Gettysburg. Second Gettysburg story that I'm proud of is that on the advocacy side, when I worked for the American Battlefield Trust, this is after I was a park ranger, I led the national coalition that prevented the creation of a casino about a half mile from the Gettysburg battlefield. So every time I drive by where it would have been, I'm very proud of not seeing anything there. It's a unique feeling to be proud of not seeing something. But that was a crazy advocacy fight that I could tell you all about. And what's the best thing about Gettysburg, or a great story from being there, is just sitting there at night when it's quiet and sort of taking it all in. And being with an evocative historic place. And maybe that's where some of my love of the past came from, is being able to kind of sit there and commune with a historic place, sort of a very metaphysical answer to all of this. But Gettysburg has always been a special place for me, and is a great place to visit. And of course, we have here in Maryland, Antietam Battlefield, which is another wonderfully evocative place. And we should do a Mako staff retreat and take you out there. That would be fun.
That would be awesome. I will pitch that for sure. I think it's a great idea, but
no
I'm
joke. I'll take you guys out there.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I'm fascinated with your historical connections and jealous of your experience in Gettysburg. And I really think that you all are doing great work, and we're really happy that we could have you on, especially National Preservation Month. Hopefully we can help beat that drum a little bit. But Michael, any closing thoughts from you before we let Nick run to go and do some more celebrating of National Preservation Month?
I think this is great value added for the kind of folks who listen to our pod, to hear a little bit about this kind of stuff. I think we've got some sympathy in mission and the kind of stuff that we do in the space that we occupy. So really grateful for your time to commit to chatting with us, talking to our listeners, and giving us an awful lot of leads to follow up on. I'm psyched now.
This is awesome. Thank you so much for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick. And we'll go ahead and leave it there. If you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, the Conduit Street blog. We'll provide all the links for Preservation Maryland so you can keep up with them as well. But for Nicholas Redding and Michael Sanderson, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.